Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's webinar, the Biotech Midas. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Hsieh, Yale College class of 2007, and I'm a co-founder of Accelerate Yale and Yale Angels. Our discussion is co-sponsored by the shared interest group, Yale Biotech, and made possible by the YAA's shared interest groups. And we are also delighted to be co-hosting our first event this evening with Yale Law School. Accelerate Yale is a global community of alumni and friends of Yale who are engaged in innovation, tech, and entrepreneurship. Please note that we are being recorded this evening with all participants muted. Tonight's session will be 1 hour, and we will reserve the final 25 minutes for your questions. If you have a question that you would like to submit, please do so via the Q&A button on the bottom bar of your screen. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our featured speaker and moderator for this evening. Sam Hendel, Yale College class of 2003, is my co-founder of Accelerate Yale and Yale Angels. He is a co-founder of DataMiner, the leading real-time AI company for event and risk detection. In addition, he is an experienced professional in the investment management industry and serves as president and portfolio manager of Levin Easterly Partners, the value investing firm. He specializes in arbitrage, event-driven, and value investing across all sectors. And our featured speaker this evening, Vivek Ramaswamy, Yale Law School class of 2013, is founder and chief executive officer of Roivant Sciences. Roivant advances the development and delivery of important medicines in disease areas where the magnitude of R&D investment from industry is disproportionately low relative to societal needs. Roivant also builds technology-focused subsidiaries focused on improving the process of developing and commercializing medicines. Roivant and its family of companies employ over 900 professionals today. Vivek graduated summa cum laude in biology from our friends up north, Harvard, in 2007, and began his career as a successful biotech investor where he oversaw investment in numerous companies, including those that helped develop curative treatment regimens for hepatitis C virus. He continued to work as an investor while earning his law degree from Yale Law School, where he was a Paul and Daisy Soros Fellow. Our team at Accelerate Yale is so excited to be bringing you this conversation this evening. And with that, I turn it over to Sam and Vivek. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Grace. Vivek, thank you so much for agreeing to do the conversation. And thank you all out there for listening. I promised that we were going to finish up by the vice presidential debate tonight, which I hope will be more watchable than the presidential debate last week.
There's only one direction for that one, so
very true. And Vivek, I'm so excited to have you here. You've had a really remarkable career, and at Accelerate Yale, we're very focused on entrepreneurship. You started your career as an investor, and then made that move to become an entrepreneur and have your own business. And I would love to hear really from sort of your days as an investor and partner at QVT, how you made that initial jump to decide to leave and start your own thing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was, it was a story that, I don't know, just came from what I was seeing as an investor. So it was sort of a natural outgrowth of where I began. So just to give you a rewind for a second. So I studied molecular biology. I was in the lab. I thought I was going to be a scientist. I got derailed into the world of biotech investing in part because I actually had done a summer internship where I found that I was having a lot more fun and found myself a lot more intellectually engaged, even in the science, as a biotech investor than I was in the lab, only because of the time horizons. The time horizons for getting from an experiment design to completion just had cycles of repetition, of waiting that didn't engage me in the same way that investing in companies that were pursuing underlying projects in biotech, may have gotten me going more. So that's what I did for about 7 years, 2007 to 2014. I spent 3 of those years. That was my time at Yale and law school. We can come back to that later. But when I went back to my job full time as an investor, I would say that I was much more interested by then in the process of developing drugs, in the way that all of these companies that I was investing in went about developing their drugs, rather than in evaluating just any given one of them at a time. And so as an investor, you often meet with management teams, you meet with companies to understand, what drugs they're developing, how you want to make your bets, risk reward assessments based on, talking to management teams. You've been an investor. It's how it works across industries. So I used to have my laptop where I would, type up my notes wearing my hat as an investor. What are the key events for each of these biotech companies? What are the data points that the management team presents as relevant? All that stuff. But I would go into those meetings with a separate notebook where I would keep a log of all of the things that I would do differently if I were actually in charge of running one of these companies. And it turned out that list started getting pretty long, pretty fast, ranging from developing a drug in the pipeline that company had discovered, but wasn't the use of proceeds for its next financing, that frustrated me, where I would sort of look at that and say, gee, that might be a pretty interesting drug. I know you're focused on oncology, but there could be a different immunology development project for this other asset that was in your pipeline that otherwise was languishing. But as an investor, I couldn't do much about that. Or I would go through a discussion about what the time and cost of a given project was and try to understand, well, gee, if this dosing period in a clinical trial was really only 6 months, then why does it take 2 years to conduct it? And if you really are saying there's millions of patients with the disease, why would it possibly take 1.5 years to go out and find 500 of them to participate in the clinical trial? But again, that wasn't something that was eligible for my concern as an investor. I was supposed to take those budgets and timelines as given, and I had a choice, either invest or don't invest, roughly speaking. So anyway, I kept a notebook about logging all the things that I would do differently if I were in charge of one of these companies. And the long story short is, one day that notebook got full, and I decided that was a time to evaluate whether I wanted to leave my job as an observer, as an investor, and really build a company based on the principles that I had ultimately logged over the last couple of years of watching those companies.
And I just reading the Roivant website and kind of understanding your model, it's very different than how a lot of big pharma and even smaller pharma companies are conducting their business. I would love to hear, and I think the audience would love to hear, if you could explain a little bit about what was your broad thesis when you left your day job to go start Roivant. What was your broad thesis on what you could do different versus what the rest of the industry was doing?
I mean, the basic thesis was, I thought we could go faster by focusing on areas that were underappreciated by the rest of the pharma industry. So there are a couple of observations about the pharma industry, most of them rooted in incentive failures. First observation is the pharma industry is an industry of followers. You could say it's a lemming problem that has plagued the industry for a long time. That means that if there's a certain therapeutic area or a certain drug target or a certain biological pathway that suddenly becomes hot, then the rest of the industry is going to quickly flock to that and away from whatever else they were focusing on. And you see that pendulum swing back and forth over the course of, roughly speaking, every few decades. So back in 2008, a year after I joined QVT as an investor, oncology was a bad word in biotech investing. That was an area where you focus on, and certainly immuno-oncology was an extra bad word, the harnessing of the immune system to fight cancer. That was an area that you stayed away from. Today, that is the epicenter of biotech innovation today, is in the field of cancer, and in particular in the field of immuno-oncology. And all it took was a couple of successes before the entire industry refocused, where most major pharma companies today think of themselves as cancer companies. The difference was that biotech discovery doesn't necessarily track the shifting tide in the way that corporate executives set their prioritization decisions, in a way that there's always a field of, there's historically, if you look back at the industry, there's frequently a number of promising discoveries in the wake that are left behind as the pharma industry shifts from left to right and back to left again. And so the way I figured we could get Roivant off the ground, the goal was to build a new version of what a big pharma company looked like. But in order to get it off the ground, very practically, might actually start with a head start by focusing on projects that already had significant investment that had gone into them, probably gone into the drug development process somewhere in the second, third, fourth, fifth inning of the process at times through phase 2, even with one, the final stage of drug development, phase 3 that's left ahead, to be able to get a head start, to be able to find those drugs in the therapeutic areas that pharma companies had moved out of, find what was promising that was left in the wake, and to use that to build the first generation of our pipeline. So that was kind of the vision for how to get off the ground. But the longer run vision was designed to address the why for why this lemming problem exists in the first place. And that's more complicated, but I think it comes down to incentive failures, as I mentioned before. What I mean by that is, if you're an R&D head in a big pharma company, either the entire R&D apparatus or the R&D head of a particular therapeutic area, and you take a risk and you succeed, you don't personally participate in the upside really at all, economically or otherwise, but certainly not economically. On the other hand, if you take that calculated risk and you fail, you actually face considerable downside. You have job security risks. It could be the beginning of one of those changing tides yet again, to say if you failed too many times in this area, if that area is out and that was the area in which you were an R&D head, your job may be on the line. And it turns out that people working in the pharma industry are just like people everywhere else. They respond to incentives, where if you have a asymmetric downside and very limited upside, you're not in a particular rush to get to the answer to a question. I actually think that that's not something nefarious. It's not something calculated. It's just something subconscious, where you have people who are not necessarily rewarded for getting to an answer more quickly. They're not going to particularly motivate themselves to get to that answer more quickly. Now, there's a further nuance, which is that if you happen to fail, but at least you're failing in an area where all of your peers in the rest of the industry were failing as well, that's not as bad of a failure as failing in an area where you're the only one who actually took that risk. And so therefore you are likely to find drugs or drug development projects that people aren't pursuing precisely because there's no safety in failing alone. So let's just call that set of incentive failures. The goal with Roivant was actually to build a company that didn't suffer from some of those man-made obstacles to the development of drugs by giving people skin in the game in the projects they work on, by aligning the incentives of the owner with the drug developers and the scientists who are actually working on the individual projects. So people could make decisions as a community of co-owners of those projects rather than a series of owners and hired hands. And that's what we did over the longer run. So initially we got started by picking up projects that were in the wake of where other pharma companies hadn't gone. More recently, we've even begun designing and developing some of our own drugs from scratch. But the broader thesis was fix the incentive failures in the pharma industry and you fix half the time and cost that the industry is burdened with.
And so you started with the in-licensing from academia or from other, there were these drugs, these sort of stranded drugs, orphan drugs, another word, but there's stranded drugs that are sitting at big pharma. How did you design it to set up? And I would love for you to explain the VANT system.
Yeah.
That focus on individual therapeutic areas. Can you talk about how you sort of set up that structure? And then I would love to hear a little more on the how you incentivize your team at Roivant Sciences, and then also incentivize when you potentially take these companies public.
Yeah, sure. So it ends up being pretty simple. I think you're from the asset management world, Sam. I think maybe some members in the audience are as well. It's like the equivalent of bringing the multi-manager hedge fund platform model to the world of drug developers. So the way you think about the VANT model is you have a group of people who are the equivalent of a pod at a multi-manager platform. That's the team. That's the company that we set up. It's like a startup company in its own right for a drug that we would have in-licensed. Today it includes drugs that we discover, but before it was drugs that we would in-license, put them into a sub. And the point of putting it into the sub is really to give actual equity, project-specific equity, to the scientists, drug developers, teams that work at that sub, such that they, like the people who put up the capital to develop that drug, have uncapped upside in the event that it succeeds, that the drug is more valuable if you get to that answer more quickly, and yet also have the ability to take calculated risks, including to the downside, in the same way that an owner would take into account. So that was the basic principle of the VANT model. Now, that's not that different on the face of it from what I've said so far from conventional venture capital. VC-backed biotech was able to harness a lot of that entrepreneurial spirit, but there's a difference. I think some of the subtle differences are with VC-backed biotech, you often are working with VCs that syndicate risk, but you have VC number one that has fund, is sort of at the beginning of fund 5, and VC number 2 that's at the end of fund 4. They may have very different time horizons. Those time horizon risks sort of misalign with what the right timing is for whether a company is actually going to go public, get acquired, or launch a product on its own. And you have incentive failures that are upstream of the very drug developer actors that are downstream. So it's a little bit different than the pharma problem, but a different type of incentive failure and clash when you have multiple owners that are constrained by different, fund life cycles. That's on the financial side. I think more fundamentally, a VC-backed biotech dedicates all of its dollars, as it sensibly should, to the development of the 1 or 2 drugs that are in its pipeline. But unlike a big pharma, it doesn't have the incentive to invest in improving the process of developing drugs, how you recruit clinical trials more effectively. That's generalizable across multiple different therapeutic areas. And if you're only going to run 1 or 2 drug development programs, you don't have enough of an incentive for it to make sense to you to actually invest in the process of developing drugs and improving that process. So VC-backed biotech systematically underinvests in that type of infrastructural kind of improvement, which at least big pharma at its best is well positioned to do. So that's where Roivant, the parent company, comes in, is that's what we do for all of our Vants. And the Vants tap into generally, in Roivant's case, it's been mostly technology-based investments that we've made in, improving patient trial recruitment, patient trial monitoring, et cetera, over the course of any given clinical study that's generalizable across different therapeutic areas. Every one of the Vants at least has an opportunity to benefit from some of that central investment that Roivant's made. So in a nutshell, the point was to borrow some of the principles of small venture-backed biotech, the entrepreneurial culture, the ability to get people who have skin in the game and really participate in the upside, but to be able to not underinvest in the kinds of things that make every one of those companies operate more efficiently.
And so effectively, you create a private sub within the Roivant Sciences structure,
right?
And then later on, I assume you're effectively take that equity that's in the private sub. When the company's ready for prime time, you raise capital through an IPO, and those scientists, that team that's in the specific Vant, is continuing as equity owners of the public company. Is that like the right way to think about it?
Sometimes. And sometimes in fact, most of our Vants we've actually kept private. One of our Vants actually reported, positive phase 3 results earlier this year and is on its way to launching its product. That's still private and wholly owned. And so it's on a case by case basis. I think the factors that influence whether we, take it public or not are several fold. I think that sometimes if you want to use that currency in additional ways by having liquid public currency, that can enable you to do deals that could further expand your pipeline. Sometimes it's important to the founding, or what we think of as our day one executive team. After Roivant set it up, we recruit the team, the opportunity to be on a path to go public, maybe an attractive recruiting tool for somebody who comes out of, maybe a big pharma drug developer who's looking to get more skin in the game, but has value in at least have an opportunity to take their company public, to be able to generate liquidity, et cetera. That might be important to a team at certain points in time. And then there's other cases in which you have biotech specific investors that really know what they want to invest in. They think this particular drug target's promising, this drug's promising, and they want an isolated bet, and in a mutually attractive win-win way, want to invest in that particular sub. That's a good case for taking a sub potentially public or through external financing as well. So across the board, we've been variegated in doing it. Many of them are actually wholly owned, and eventually, if that remains wholly owned perpetually, then the dividends that come from cash flows, the management team will share in that in the same way. In other cases, we have majority owned public subsidiaries that ultimately have gone on to be listed while remaining under the Roivant umbrella and in the Roivant family. And I think the third path is also divestiture, which we did for the first time last year, which is once the Vants get to a certain point in time, it may be best held in the hands of another pharma company. So actually at the end of last year, we did a deal with a large Japanese pharmaceutical company called Sumitomo Dainippon Pharma. They paid us $3 billion for, it was in part for an equity stake in Roivant, but $2 billion of those dollars were for buying 5 Vants that we had built up to that point that are now in their hands, that those were strategic for them. They're now investing behind them and launching the products that come out of it. So those are kind of the three paths for us: keep them wholly owned, potentially do external third-party financings, or divest.
And do you foresee Roivant staying as a private company? Is there any reason, that you would ever take the entire thing public, or?
Yeah, it's not something that has been a priority, because we've raised a lot of capital privately, have been able to succeed by keeping Roivant private, but we've considered it. I think that the long run plan has always been to take Roivant public at some point as a large cap pharma company. But I think part of what we're doing at Roivant is also investing in the long run, not just on individual drug development programs, but actually building hard technology to actually improve the process of both discovering and developing drugs. And we wanted to really allow that to reach fruition before we ever took Roivant public. I think we're much further along on that today than we were, a few years ago. So I think that becomes a relevant question for us going forward. Sure.
In terms of the opportunities you're seeing, it sounds like you're doing some of the discovery on your own right now through some.
Now we are, yeah.
What, where are the areas you're seeing the most opportunity for in-licensing? Is it coming from universities? Is it coming from, large cap large cap biotech companies? Where are you sort of seeing the best science getting done? And how is your model, taking advantage of that?
Good question. It's a hard question to answer, because I think that, our model was born of one that was sort of opportunistic in nature, right? Born of being opportunistic in nature. And what I mean by that is it's value-based in that we're not saying that we want to be the leader in oncology, neurology, and infectious disease, and then go out and build expertise in those areas, and that's what defines Roivant. To the contrary, the question is, where are there promising drugs that deserve to be developed that aren't being developed because of the structural failures or the incentive failures elsewhere in the industry? And so when you're operating according to like an opportunistic model, and I think that it's kind of interesting, because I would draw that pattern between there's businesses of one kind and businesses of another kind, and there's incredibly successful businesses that come out of both models. For the opportunistic vintage, opportunities come from unpredictable places. And so I guess that's a way of saying I can't necessarily generalize, in the sense that there are promising drugs that we have gotten out of in-licensing transactions from big pharma companies. There's other promising drugs that have come out of earlier stage funded academic research. And there are small biotech companies that are in the process of either a pivot or a cash constraint or whatever, that we've in-licensed or partnered with as well. And we've had both successful projects and unsuccessful projects that have come from each of those sources. So I think about it less as a sourcing issue in terms of one of those reserves being any more or less promising than the other, but I'd say more in terms of areas where you actually have, historically at least, companies or academic institutions that have that of the strategic kind. So not the opportunistic kind, the companies that say, I want to be excellent at this, that have spent years moving the ball forward in the research agenda in that particular field. And for whatever reason, there's a change in tide that prevents them from being able to continue along that journey. The ability to benefit from that tuition already paid, those lessons already learned, when others have decided that that field is no longer one that's of interest to them, those are kind of where the most fertile opportunities come from. And sometimes that happens in academia, and sometimes that happens in companies. But that contrarian spirit, that's kind of where we, where our model thrives at its best.
Great. And, the industry that you're in is inherently risky. These are all risk reward bets. Some drugs work, some drugs don't. Would love to hear some specific examples of, areas of failure and how you've dealt with that, and then also areas of success that you guys have experienced at Roivant.
Sure. So I'll go with the failure first. In some senses, the failures have been more edifying than the successes. The first major phase 3 project we pursued, the first drug we took into phase 3 was a drug for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. It was one of those areas that a lot of companies had encountered a lot of failures. They'd invested a ton. They had discovered promising molecules, but said that it's time to throw in the towel. There are too many failures, and we don't understand enough about this disease. We're going elsewhere. Well, that was the trend, and GSK was one of those companies. So we in-licensed a drug from GSK that actually their head of neuroscience said that, look, it's not a sure bet, but this is one of the most promising drugs that I've seen come out of this company's pipeline. I think it deserves to be developed. I've met with the FDA. They're supportive of moving into phase 3 with a plan that I think is practical, and someone ought to develop it. Okay, so I, took a look at the data myself. I wasn't an expert in Alzheimer's disease per se. I had evaluated drugs as an investor for the better part of a decade before then, and thought his assessment was fair. And there were a number of other Alzheimer's experts who came to the table, including one of the guys who developed one of the few Alzheimer's drugs that's ever been approved, and the best selling of them, Aricept, which itself was a shelved drug 20 years ago that he lifted off the shelf of a Japanese pharmaceutical company to develop into a major blockbuster. He looked at this data set and probably was most eventually began as the most skeptical and converted to probably the most optimistic of the bunch in a way that I put great weight on as well. And we said, this is a project we're going to pursue. So we licensed that drug. We did the phase 3. It was high profile. It was something that could have changed the field of medicine if it were approved, a new drug in Alzheimer's disease after 2 decades of miserable failure at a time when society needs it more than ever. And then the day came where you unblind the results of the study, you see the results, and that one turned out to be a failure, pretty close to a flat failure. And that was pretty devastating, I would say, in terms of not just the adverse impact on the business necessarily, but on that feeling of being so close to being within striking distance of something that would have truly been world changing if it was successful, and at least to feel that you were one flip of the card away from in the final step in the 9th inning of that process, really the end of the phase 3 study, to come up short is pretty devastating. And at the same time, it was something that going through that relatively early in the life of our company was something that also strengthened us to be able to say that, okay, if we can deal with that failure, I'm pretty sure we can get through most anything else that we're going to encounter for a long time to come as well. And we still had a number of other projects that were mid-flight. And now, I would say years later after that failure, we happened to be in a stretch where for the last year and a half or about 2 years or so, we've now had our last 8 phase 3 studies consecutively having been successes. And so that was one after the other, I think, a bit of a tailwind over the last year, but I'm sure that that's not going to last, and we're going to have failures in the future as well. And I guess if I had to worry, it's definitely more fun to have success than failure. But I think that the successes you're more risky to build a sense of complacency from your successes than you are to actually probably build grit from your failures. And so I don't know, it's like,
yeah, and
a bit of medicine.
I would love to, as an investor, I have failures, and we invest, you invest in a company, it doesn't work. Was it different when it was your own company rather than just being a passive investor?
Yeah.
When you're an active investor and sort of the person who's in the weeds in the business.
It was very different. So I was an investor too in biotech, and had some successes as an investor, but definitely had failures along the way too. That's just the nature of biotech investing. And it wasn't very personal. It sort of felt like before I became an investor, I read a book because I was going from science to investing. I wanted to learn about business, so I read a book. It was like a book by Jack Welch. And one of the opening lines of the book was, business is a game. And I was like, okay, this sounds interesting. Let me read a little bit more about it. And it was kind of a silly book in the end, but I took a few things away from it. But it probably framed the way that I thought about my job as a biotech investor. It felt, if I'm being blunt about it, it felt like a game. You're playing a sport. It was fun. It was, if you're successful, lucrative. It was competitive. And it certainly had a lot of the elements of like almost playing a professional sport. And a failure was like losing a game. You're in the NBA finals, it's going on. Okay. You're down 3-1 in the series. So what? That's, you're the Miami Heat, you're the Los Angeles Lakers. Okay. You're a guy, you're this hedge fund, you're that hedge fund. You bet against that stock. You bet in favor of this one. You were right. Sometimes you're wrong. Sometimes it had the quality of a game. And I think that I think the first time my worldview changed on treating business like a game was when I went through that process of developing that Alzheimer's drug, and certainly at the time that it culminated in a painful failure. And it was personal for me because, yes, you're on the front row seat. You are interacting with the physicians, even with the patient communities that more so than investors are eager for what you might be able to do to change the course of their lives. And for an investor, this is part of a portfolio, right? They're going to be fine. If you're a patient with Alzheimer's disease isn't part of your portfolio. It is, in the case of that disease, something that defines the essence of who you have become, even if it's not the essence of who you are at your core. And I think seeing that firsthand and then, and thinking that I was within striking distance of being able to make an impact. My mom was a geriatric psychiatrist who spent most of her career treating patients with Alzheimer's disease in nursing homes in Ohio, as it turned out. And, and she came out of retirement to help me, get that project to the point that it was too along the way, and marshal, people in her old network. It was all very personal for me in seeing that culminate in a medicine that just fell short of what you felt it could accomplish. And so it was totally different is the short answer. And I don't think it was just as a function of, I put in more work. That's part of it, right? There's more effort involved in building something and actually getting your hands dirty with the operations. But it wasn't just that. It was, I think, the front row exposure to being the person who people who need you are relying on in a way that you certainly don't feel that same weight on your shoulders as one of many passive investors in a project.
Yeah. So a few more questions for you, and then we are going to open up to Q&A. I would love to hear about Immunovant and what you've been doing in terms of COVID-19. As much as I know it's a public company, but as much as you can discuss, would love to hear the experience there and the successes so far of that company.
Cool. Yeah. So I'm happy to tell you about Immunovant, and that's actually in a different direction than COVID-19, which I can also talk about too. So, Immunovant is a company that, as you might have guessed from the name, focuses in the area of immunology, but it's developing one drug against one fundamental immunological target called FcRn. It's the neonatal Fc receptor. But if you hit FcRn, you're able to take down pathogenic IgG levels. There are these antibodies that are floating around in your body. Some people have too high of IgG levels, and it turns out that there are many, many diseases caused by high IgG levels. And so that's become kind of a hot target in biotech in recent years, albeit not in pharma. And actually, I want to just comment on that for a second, where there's certain targets that pharma is all over, right? Where there's a top-down expertise in one therapeutic area. Those tend to be areas where big pharma does really well because they're organized in therapeutic area silos. And then there's sometimes these targets that you see in biotech once in a while where it's a fundamental biological pathway, but it implicates 6 different disease categories. So for this FcRn target, there's disease indications ranging from ophthalmology to dermatology to neurology to autoimmune disorders of different kinds that are implicated by this target. And big pharma tends to miss those actually early on because they're used to seeing the world through disease category-based views. And so here there's a number of small biotech companies, a few that began to develop anti-FcRn antibodies. And we found what we thought was a differentiated one from a South Korean company that we had a unique relationship with and ended up putting that into development. So we in-licensed that, began the development, put it into a Vant. I saw one of the questions that popped up in the Q&A, we made a reference to SPACs. So we actually were, I think, probably the first people to take Immunovant public via a SPAC last December before the boom started. Now it's starting to annoy me a little bit, but it was people like, what the heck is that you just did with Immunovant?
So it is a boom, yeah.
Yeah, it is a boom now. But when we were in the discussions last year, we were kind of in the vanguard cohort of people who were looking at that. So Immunovant went public via SPAC, and it's done incredibly well since then. It had a couple of positive data readouts this year. It's now $3.5 billion public company or so, of which we own a significant majority. So that was the journey of Immunovant. But it's still heading into phase 3 studies, and lasting success is still far from certain. That's going to be determined by phase 3 studies, how we compete against others in the landscape. But it's a good example of the Roivant model in action in terms of focusing on the kind of target that has good reasons to not be classically found in pharma, because the target implicates so many different disease areas that no given disease area head would have staked his career on it from scratch. At the same time, once we put a team together, this was one where it did make sense to go public. We were able to recruit a great team as part of the prospects of being a potential public company, did it in a creative way that was at least different at the time that we took it public, and yet still continue to remain the owner, majority owner, certainly, of Immunovant, hoping for its success in the long run. So it's a good case study of the Roivant model in action.
Perfect. And, I love how, how your model is focused on the entrepreneurial journey and incentivizing your employees, rather than the big pharma model where, everyone's sort of stuck owning Eli Lilly or Bristol stock, and they don't have that direct ownership. Just I have a broader question on incentives in the whole biotech and pharma industry. And maybe this pivots to the debate tonight. But drug pricing is an area that, of course, always gets the political attention. How do we continue to incent companies to develop and go through this very risky process? You spend so much money on a drug, and it can fail or succeed at the end, while still caring for patients in a way that doesn't break doesn't break the sort of the cost side of our medical system.
Yeah, sure. So I think that there is definitely an irreducible question and an irreducible trade-off at the heart of that question. And I think that irreducible trade-off is the more of a financial incentive on the back of success for an innovative drug that you have, the more innovation you're going to see. The less of a reward we as a society provide, the less innovation we're going to see. I'm not beginning with the assumption that more innovation is necessarily a good thing. That's a societal question to adjudicate. Different people are entitled to different views on that question. But there's definitely an irreducible question of a difficult trade-off at the heart of that equation. I'd point out that it's while a lot of countries in Europe, most of Europe has made a choice that Europe is not going to incentivize innovation in the same way in return for reining in cost. That's a decision that European regulators have made. They've been in part protected from the downside consequence of that trade-off, in part because the United States has made the opposite decision. And when you're a drug company, once you've gotten to the finish line in the United States, at the margin, there's no downside to going ahead and launching that product in Europe anyway. And so even as we've seen reduced market access in Europe of companies that are launching their products later in Europe than they do in the United States, or don't make the drug as widely available in Europe, that looks like the case study today for the experiment of, okay, if you reimburse less for drugs, here's how much less innovation you get. I think that is a flawed experiment, because you have to assume that Europe is a closed system when it's not. It's actually influenced by effectively the United States subsidizing not only its own innovation, but innovation that the rest of the world stands to benefit from as well. And so I think that there's a trade-off there. And I think that some people point to Europe as an example of what that trade-off looks like, and to see whether we're willing to trade off that much innovation for that much cost saving. I guess the point I'd point out is it's not actually a perfect lab in that sense. On the other hand, it's at least interesting that China has actually begun to reform its drug reimbursement regime in a way that is favoring greater reimbursement for truly innovative breakthrough drugs as well. That's communist China we're talking about here. And that's curious and ought to be interesting to us as well. And so I sort of draw those international analogies by way of coming back to how we might want to think about it in the United States. Is there is certainly a competitive advantage to being at the forefront of incentivizing innovation. See the race for vaccines in our hour of need in the year of COVID-19. But that's just an example of what we might be able to say about eventually a cure to Alzheimer's disease or a cure to cardiometabolic disease, the sources of significant cost burden and lack of competitiveness on a global stage. That's an issue that goes beyond just incentivizing pharmaceutical companies and rewarding innovation. It goes to protecting the country as a whole. Now, I said that there's a kernel at the heart of the question that's an irreducible trade-off, and I think that's true. But I actually think that there's a lot more low-hanging fruit to tackle, wood to chop along the way before you actually have to get to that final question of that trade-off. And I think that the elegant nature of that trade-off is a bit of a smokescreen for inefficiencies at every step along the way. I'll speak candidly, if I may, about the fact that we will have developed a vaccine for COVID-19 whenever we do, right? Maybe it's not this month, maybe it's not next month, maybe it's not the month after that. But whatever it is, it's going to be a lot shorter than the 10-year cycle that it normally takes to develop a vaccine. We're going to find ourselves, and I think public health regulators in the United States are going to find themselves in a difficult spot, being able to both tell the public that these are vaccines that you should feel comfortable taking, even though they were developed in a year, while also saying that, no, we actually have to have a system that takes 10 years to safely develop vaccines that the public ought to have confidence in taking. And I think you're going to see some of the same people who have made one of those arguments in one setting make a different argument in this particular setting. And I think I think part of the answer is regulation. I think part of the answer is the drug development process is far more cumbersome, far more expensive, far more inefficient than it needs to be because of regulation. And I think in the shadow of that regulation, we've also had an industry that's been built on the edifice of, the managerial class in corporate big pharma has made that part of internal to pharma's culture, even irrespective of the regulators. And so the analogy I'd give you is, look, they teach you in law school. They teach you in law. I don't have to go to law school to learn this. I learned it in high school. There's 3 branches of government: you have the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. And you think that's the edifice on which our legal system sits. And I think what you learn in the real world as part of a regulated industry is that there's actually this 4th branch of government, the administrative state, that ultimately has a lot of accountability shifted onto itself from the 3 branches of government behind the scenes that actually controls a lot of the way that vision gets implemented. Well, it turns out there's a shadow analogy in the corporate sphere as well, where what they might teach you in business school is, the 3 legs to the stool of launching a new business, or founders who start new businesses, investors who back those founders, and employees who that founder hires in order to ultimately realize the idea. And I think that at least big pharma, I think, is an epitome of this phenomenon. There's kind of a 4th leg of the stool too, the equivalent of the administrative state. There's a sort of a deep corporate version of this that exists in big pharma as well, where you have a managerial class, what I call the managerial class, at least, that is neither the originator of the ideas nor the implementer, but sits somewhere in between. It's almost built on the shadowed bureaucracy of government, of FDA. A lot of the pharma bureaucracies are named on the basis of corresponding divisions on which the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA is built. And I think that there's a cycling effect where even if you now are at a point where you reform the regulatory regime, there's actually a residual morass that is the vestige of years of a big pharma culture that ultimately will still exist and needs to be independently tackled. And so, I think as an entrepreneur, I've been among those who are taking aim at the managerial class on the private sector, but I think that you're going to have to see equivalent reform in the public sector as well. And I personally think that there's a lot more cost we can wring out of the time and cost of developing medicines that we could tackle as a strict benefit to society before we end up at that irreducible trade-off between actually incentivizing innovation and containing societal cost.
That's some of the speed and incentives that you're bringing. And I guess it's tricky because the FDA, safety, but it is a very long and arduous process, and I'm sure it's a little bit antiquated, and they haven't really reformed too much in the last 50 years.
I mean, it's a little trite to sort of just point at the big bad FDA and sort of blame them, and they kind of end up being a punching bag unfairly at times. And part of the point I wanted to highlight was actually I think there have been a lot of well-intended reforms at FDA, but you kind of have 60 years worth of corporate culture that were built in the shadow of the assumption of one FDA. And it was sort of built in the shadow of a culture that came to exist in the private sector here in big pharma that now is a creation of its own that needs to be tackled. So it's not just about reforming the FDA alone, but I do think that there is going to be, an interesting question before us about safety, as you say. Next year, I predict that we're going to have to societally look ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves if we're really confident in a vaccine that could have been developed in the course of 12 to 16 months for this disease, in the case of COVID-19, then why is it that we accept as a premise that we have to have a system that ultimately takes, for a vaccine, literally 10 plus years on average? And 10 plus years isn't just time, that's cost borne over those 10 years as well. And I think that that's a hard question we're going to have to ultimately, honestly reckon with. And I think it's going to make people at FDA uncomfortable to answer that question. I think that discomfort, I think a lot of good can come with engaging and confronting that discomfort too. And I think the implications for the drug pricing debate are profound. Great.
And I'm gonna welcome Grace back to open it up to some Q&A. Vivek, we're going to have another conversation on the side about stakeholder shareholder model.
Sure. We can do that too. We can leave that into the
Q&A TikTok here. But Grace, why don't you join us and ask away?
Thanks, Sam. So Vivek, we have a ton of questions for you from the audience. I'm going to try to get through as many of these as possible. I think you answered some of them. Thank you for doing that already. There is some interest in understanding a little bit more about the overarching strategy, sort of how it is that you attract talent to Roivant, and what it is that makes the organization different as opposed to another agile, innovative biotech. That was a question from William. And Tom also asks, what happens to the people in the companies that fail? And alongside that, sort of a question around the amount of equity that Roivant typically retains in the subs, and how much it is that you expect to have to invest in order to generate a return.
Sure. So there's a wide range of questions there. Let me start with the talent one. So one of the things that's unique about Roivant is we recruit talent not just from within the biopharma industry, but from outside biopharma as well. So we do campus recruiting. I can't tell you for sure if we're at Yale this year, but we've been at Yale before, going to top universities, getting fresh talent in a way that kind of is similar to the people we'd be competing with to get top graduates might be Google and Amazon and Goldman Sachs and Facebook, but very few people very few, if any, pharma companies are tapping into talent pools that are on that end of the inexperienced spectrum. And there's costs and benefits to that. I think one of the benefits is that you recruit a group of people who don't have to unlearn their way of doing business in big pharma, but who actually are a blank slate to be able to see problems through a fresh lens without an antecedent bias. The flip side is our industry is one that requires expertise, is highly technical, is regulated. And so we mix those talent pools. And I think that's been good for both poles of that, talent curve that we recruit from. So that's not everything that I would say about talent. I think there's something to be said for the incentive model. I think there's something to be said for the way we set up our teams. But that's one thing I'd point to that's pretty unique about Roivant relative to the rest of the pharma industry is our recruiting philosophy looks much more like a tech company or even like a finance firm. I used to come from the world of hedge funds. That's where I borrowed some of our recruiting tactics. Bringing that to the pharma industry, I think, has been mostly a net win for us. Then there was the question about what sort of equity does Roivant retain in the subs? We generally keep majority ownership in the subs. And a big part of that comes from not just the capital we put in, but the enabling feature of what Roivant brings to the table, right? So these drugs would not have been generally developed, certainly not at the speed that they were, but for the Roivant platform. And, I think that people look at the at the capital that we've put in to retain ownership of subsidiaries that are worth a lot, I think that that's sort of defies logic in some sense for some people, at least at first blush. But it actually is, that ignores the costs that we're bearing at the parent company in building a platform that makes those companies more valuable more quickly. So if you're to use the asset management analogy, and I saw one of the questions referring to another asset manager that incubates companies, et cetera, that's like a 2 and 20 model where you have a pool of capital. The general partner takes 2% of the assets to run a management company, but is otherwise making investments. Suffice to say, off Roivant's capital base, we spend a lot more than 2% on the parent company because we're building the kind of technology, the kind of platforms that make our vants more valuable more quickly and launch and stand up our vants more quickly as well. And even after the vants are mature, are able to benefit from the kinds of technical capabilities we built at Roivant. I think when taking that into account, that normalizes the returns that we see for individual drug development projects. But then we win on the back end because I think a lot of that IP generated even on the hard technology we build at Roivant has independent value in its own right. So a little bit technical there, but that I think tied up a couple of the questions that I was seeing.
Absolutely, thank you. And a recent question that came in from Hsieh is how Roivant is thinking about your business strategy in this new normal situation. How has that evolved, and how has COVID-19 impacted that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that we're still in the thick of it. So, I think I've seen a lot of CEOs offering kind of firm commentary about how COVID-19 has changed everything and what the future is going to look like. They may just have a lot more foresight than me because I'm not yet in a position to make that declaration. We're all working remotely. I think I have been net surprised by how much we have been able to accomplish while remaining more or less. We did have a first wave reopening of our main office, but more or less while with most of our staff working remotely. And I don't think I can't tell you exactly what's going to necessarily be different in the future versus today in a way of working as a company in general. In biotech, I think that I don't want to keep coming back to this theme, but I do think there's going to be about this time next year where we are going to have to come back and ask the hard question of whether all of the hoops that we jump through to get a new therapeutic approved for diseases that to the people who have them are every bit as important as COVID-19 at the individual level are delayed for as long as we allow them to be delayed, when in the back of COVID-19, the pharma industry was able to rise to the occasion as quickly as it did. That's, I think, going to be the biggest change that we're going to see in biotech is, an inability to tolerate that hypocrisy, I think is what we'll ultimately see it as once the dust has settled post COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. Great. And there have been a couple of questions from the audience around your experience as a founder. Samuel asks, what would you say were some of the most important things to know or that you wish you knew or had done when you were transitioning to the role of founder of a startup? And then more specifically, William asks, what were some unexpected challenges in drug development that you didn't foresee going into Roivant, and how have you overcome them?
Okay, yeah. I think the first one is more general. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of things I would put on that list, but I think the thing that I had to grow into the most was actually relying on a team, not having a team, but actually relying on a team that didn't necessarily operate according to like a hub and spoke model. I said that, part of working at a hedge fund beforehand had an analogy to feel like I was playing a game, like I was playing a professional sport. I guess the sport that I grew up playing and that's still near and dear to my heart and keep up with today is playing tennis, which is an individual sport. And my life as an investor felt a lot like tennis in the sense that it was individualist. It didn't require a team. yes, there were other people involved, but they were in service of the objective that I sort of care to advance as the decision maker
The
on.
decision is yours, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I probably made the mistake of importing that model into a field that is inherently a team sport in order to succeed. And I probably started with much more of a hub and spoke model. And I think one of the things that, one of the things that I wish I had done earlier, and leaves me, I think, a lot more comfortable today, is that that even without the center of that hub and spoke model, take the hub out, and the wheel still holds its own. And that's because it actually isn't a hub and spoke model now anymore at all. We've turned over different people in different positions to get there. It takes iterations to build into it. But, today, relative to when I got started, there's a team that is able to work with itself, of which I'm a part. And I think that that's a hard thing to grapple with as a founder. And there may be a certain point in the journey where that's possible, when it's not possible early in the journey. So I'm not saying that you could just on day one assume that that exists when it doesn't, but I didn't even know what that felt like until I had really, until I'd really gotten well into the journey.
And then just the specific question surrounding drug development, and then I'll
right
back to Sam.
Yeah. So changes that we expect to see in drug development.
Or things that you didn't anticipate going in.
Yeah. I didn't anticipate how messy it was, right? Because I think you sort of see, as an investor, you sort of see things on a PowerPoint page. There's a budget, there's a, trial protocol description. Here are the patients you bring in, here are the ones you don't. Great. You make an investment decision. And I think that I did not appreciate just how, in the real world, how messy that is. It's sort of like, some kinds of art where if you look at it from like really far away, it looks really clean. And then you get up really close and it's kind of just like a messy mosaic, and you kind of can't really, I can't tell you which artistic movement that represents, but it definitely fits. It definitely fits one of them, I'm sure. That's what I would say about biotech and drug development, is that from an investor afar, it all looks very clean when it's in the PowerPoint tradition. But when you get into the on the ground tradition of the reality, it's a very different and much more messy experience. Not in a bad way, but just in a way that you probably shouldn't surprise you if you think about patients who are sick, coming into a hospital, shipping supplies, blinded. One of them gets placebo, one of them doesn't get drug. There's a doctor that has discretion about who gets into the trial, who doesn't. People miss their visits. People forget to take their pills. I mean, there's an infinite set of variables that you don't really think about when you're sort of looking at it from the outside in.
Right. Sure. It makes things very interesting.
Yeah, it does. It's been edifying at the least.
Sam, I'll let you ask the last question.
I'll ask the last question, then we'll go watch this crazy debate. Tonight's Accelerate Yale event is co-sponsored by Yale BioTech and the Yale Law School. So Yale Law School question, Vivek. What did you gain from your education at Yale that's helped you in your entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah, sure. So I went to law school. I saw one of the questions pop up, one of the early questions on this too. So I'll address that too. Is I went to law school because I'd been so science-centric up to that point in my education and even as a biotech investor. And I kind of had this itch at the intersection of law and political philosophy that I really wanted to scratch, and that I had never really fully scratched. So Yale Law was a good place for me to do that. And I'm glad I did, because I think my interests are more expansive today than they otherwise would have been. I'm writing a book on this other topic that we didn't get to talking about, Sam, on stakeholder capitalism, and why I think that's a dangerous new reinvention of capitalism for our democracy. But the thing that I took away from my time in law school was the ability to see an argument or a point of view the way you look at a set of clothes, in that there's no harm in trying it on. And if it doesn't fit, you can still put it back and you don't have to buy it. But at least you get to try it on. And I enjoyed that part of law school in a way that has probably made me a more effective entrepreneur and I think biotech CEO. we have a real general counsel who opines on the legal questions. I don't do that. But the effect that it had on me most was the ability to, try on a perspective for a second, like you actually believed it, even if at the end of the day you came out and decided that it wasn't for you. And I am worried, both societally, and I've been blunt all along, I'll be blunt here too, and at Yale in particular, about the erosion of that culture. Because I think it's part of what makes Yale special. It certainly made Yale special when I was there. It's what made the law school special. And I think that for the sake of the future of not only American democracy, but I think American culture, we owe it to ourselves to preserve that environment where people can, without fear, with impunity, try on a point of view as their own for a little bit, even if it's the wrong one in the end, and not be afraid of the consequences of doing that.
Perfect. On that note, Vivek, thank you so much. This is a fantastic talk. We really appreciate it. And we will have this up on YouTube in the next couple of days on the Accelerate Yale YouTube channel. Thank you so much, and everyone have a good night.
Thanks for having me. Talk to you guys. Thank you. Thanks,
Yeah.
Grace. Thanks, Sam. Bye.